Ethan Walker bought an abandoned jail for $6. 3 hours later, a stranger in a dark vehicle tried to make sure his dog never made it home. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. And if you believe loyalty can uncover the kind of truth money tries to bury, leave a comment, subscribe, and stay with this story until the very end. The wind rolled across the empty plains of western Kansas like a whisper from another century. Dry grass bent beneath a pale October sky, and the rusted skeleton of Blackstone County Jail stood alone at the edge of town, forgotten by everyone except the crows that nested in its broken watchtower. Most people drove past without looking. The building had become part of the landscape, like an old scar the town had learned not to touch. But on that morning, a dusty blue pickup truck pulled into the cracked gravel lot. Behind the wheel sat Ethan Walker, a 42-year-old former Navy SEAL with broad shoulders, weathered hands, and tired hazel eyes that had learned, the hard way, how quickly a life could be taken apart. A faded tattoo of a German shepherd stretched along his right forearm, disappearing beneath the sleeve of his flannel shirt. Another rested against the side of his neck, hidden beneath the collar. He had earned medals overseas. He had led men through storms most people could not imagine. Yet none of that mattered now, because 3 days earlier, Ethan had buried his father. And 2 days earlier, his own family had buried him in a different way. They took the farm. They took the land. They took nearly every piece of the inheritance his father had meant to leave behind. Lawyers filled conference rooms with paperwork while relatives exchanged smiles that never reached their eyes. When everything was finished, Ethan's share of his father's estate amounted to $6. 6 wrinkled $1 bills slid across a polished table as though they were doing him a favor. Nobody protested. Nobody stood beside him. Nobody except Ranger, the only soul in that room who never looked away from him. The German shepherd sat quietly at his feet during the entire reading of the will, amber eyes watching every face in the room. Sometimes dogs understand the truth in a room before any person is brave enough to say it. Ranger understood enough. Now the dog sat in the passenger seat, ears perked toward the old jail, his nose pressed against the window. Something had captured his attention before Ethan even shut off the engine. "Easy, buddy," Ethan said with a faint smile. Ranger did not look away. The old dog remained completely still. That alone was unusual. Ranger had spent 6 years beside Ethan, through training exercises, lonely highways, sleepless nights, and the difficult transition back into civilian life. Ethan trusted him more than he trusted most people. If Ranger sensed something, Ethan paid attention. The county clerk had laughed when Ethan purchased the property. $6 was all it took. Nobody else had bid. Nobody wanted a collapsing jail built in 1919. The roof leaked. Half the windows were shattered. Weeds pushed through the concrete foundation. But Ethan had not bought it because it was valuable. He bought it because it was the only thing in town nobody could take from him. He stepped out of the truck. The autumn air smelled of dust, rust, and distant rain. Ranger jumped down beside him and immediately started toward the entrance. The chains hanging from the front gate swayed softly in the breeze. Their metallic rattle echoed through the empty yard. For a moment, Ethan felt as though the building was watching them. The thought made him chuckle. "Guess it's ours now," he muttered. Ranger stopped. His ears stiffened. The dog stared toward a dark second-floor window. Ethan followed his gaze. Nothing moved. No faces. No shadows. Just broken glass reflecting sunlight. Yet Ranger released a low rumble deep in his chest. Not fear. Not aggression. Something closer to recognition. Ethan felt a strange chill crawl across his shoulders. Then Ranger suddenly bolted toward the side of the building. His paws kicked up gravel as he disappeared around the corner. "Ranger!" Ethan called. The dog did not return. Ethan hurried after him. The jail loomed larger with every step. Rust stained the walls like dried tears. Wind moaned through broken bars. Somewhere inside the structure, a loose metal door slammed once. Then silence returned. Ethan rounded the corner and stopped. Ranger stood frozen beside the old foundation. His nose hovered inches above the ground. His body was tense, focused, intent. And beneath his paws, hidden beneath decades of dirt and weeds, something metallic caught the sunlight. Something that had not ended up there by accident. Ranger did not move. The German shepherd stood over the patch of earth as if guarding something sacred. The late afternoon sun dragged long shadows across the side of the jail, turning the rusted bars above into dark lines across the cracked foundation. Ethan stepped closer and brushed aside a cluster of weeds with the toe of his boot. Beneath the dirt, a small piece of metal reflected the sunlight. It looked old. Not trash. Not debris carried by the wind. Something placed there deliberately. Ranger lowered his head and nudged the spot again. His amber eyes remained fixed on Ethan, waiting. Ethan had learned years ago that the dog never insisted without reason. He crouched and pushed aside more dirt with his hands. The soil was dry and loose near the surface, but packed harder underneath. Within seconds, a rusted chain emerged from the ground. The links disappeared beneath the foundation wall of the old jail. Ethan frowned. That made no sense. He followed the chain with his eyes until it vanished into a narrow crack between the concrete and the earth. "What are you trying to show me, buddy?" he asked quietly. Ranger responded by pawing the ground once. Then again, Ethan studied the chain. It was not large enough to support a gate or anchor equipment. Whatever it belonged to had been hidden intentionally. A cool gust swept across the property. Somewhere above them, a loose shutter tapped softly against brick. The sound echoed through the empty structure. Ethan stood and glanced toward the second-floor windows. For a brief moment, he thought he saw movement. A shadow crossing behind broken glass. He blinked and it was gone. Probably a bird. Probably nothing. Yet a strange feeling settled into his chest. The same feeling he used to get before missions when his instincts noticed. Something his eyes could not. Ranger suddenly lifted his head. His ears turned toward the gravel road leading to the property. A vehicle was approaching. The distant engine hummed against the silence of the plains. Ethan straightened as an aging white pickup rolled through the front gate. Dust followed behind it in a pale cloud. The truck stopped 20 yards away. An elderly man stepped out slowly, using the door for support. He looked to be in his late 70s. Thin, weathered. A faded denim jacket hung loosely from his frame. His silver hair stirred in the breeze. Ranger watched him carefully, but did not growl. The old man removed his cap and nodded toward Ethan. "You the fellow who bought Blackstone?" he asked. His voice carried the rough edges of age and years spent outdoors. "Depends who's asking," Ethan replied. The old man gave a tired, careful smile. "Name is Walter Briggs. Been living in this county longer than most people can remember." His gaze shifted toward the jail. The smile faded. "Saw your truck. Figured I ought to come by." Ethan folded his arms. "Why?" Walter hesitated. His eyes lingered on the building as though recalling something unpleasant. "Because nobody has owned that place for very long." The wind seemed to quiet around them. Even the distant sounds of the highway disappeared. Ethan waited. Walter finally sighed. "People around here stopped talking about Blackstone years ago. Easier that way. Some stories are better left sleeping." Ranger moved closer to Ethan's side. Walter noticed the dog and studied him carefully. "That shepherd yours seems smart. Smarter than me most days." The old man chuckled softly, but his expression remained troubled. "Then listen to him." Ethan looked back toward the chain emerging from the dirt. "You know what this is?" Walter's eyes followed his gaze. The moment he saw the exposed metal, all color seemed to drain from his face. He took a step forward, then stopped. For several seconds he said nothing. "You dug that up today?" he asked quietly. "Ranger found it." Walter swallowed. His hands tightened around the brim of his cap. "Then maybe it has started." Ethan frowned. "Started what?" The old man looked toward the jail again. The setting sun reflected in the broken windows like tiny flames. Walter's voice dropped almost to a whisper. "Whatever your father wanted you to find." Ethan felt his pulse quicken. He had not mentioned his father. Not once. "How do you know my father?" Walter stared at him for a long moment. Then he gave a slow nod toward the building. "Because 30 years ago, your father stood exactly where you are standing now. And he was holding that same chain." The last rays of sunlight faded behind the prairie horizon as silence settled over Blackstone County Jail. Ethan stood motionless, staring at Walter Briggs. The old man's words stayed in the cool evening air like a warning that had waited 30 years to be spoken. 30 years ago, your father stood exactly where you are standing now. Ethan felt something tighten deep inside his chest. His father had rarely spoken about Blackstone. In fact, he had barely mentioned it at all. Growing up, Ethan remembered long stretches of silence whenever anyone brought up the abandoned jail. As a boy, he assumed it was simply another forgotten building. As a man, he realized silence often protected things people feared to discuss. Ranger sat beside him, calm but alert. The German shepherd's amber eyes shifted between Walter and the exposed chain beneath the dirt. The dog seemed unusually focused, as though every word mattered. Walter slowly approached the foundation and crouched beside the rusted metal links. His weathered fingers hovered above them without touching. "I have not seen this in decades," he whispered. Ethan folded his arms. "My father never told me anything about this place." Walter nodded sadly. "That does not surprise me." A distant train horn echoed across the plains. The lonely sound drifted through the evening darkness and disappeared into the vast Kansas sky. Walter remained silent for several seconds before speaking again. "Your father was one of the few honest men left in this county." Ethan looked away toward the jail. Broken windows reflected the fading light. The building seemed older now, heavier somehow. People say things like that after someone dies. Walter shook his head. "No, I said it while he was alive too." Ethan studied the old man carefully. There was no hesitation in his voice, no performance, only certainty. "Then tell me why he never mentioned any of this." Walter sighed and stood slowly. "Because some truths become dangerous the moment they are spoken aloud." The wind picked up again. Dry grass rustled across the empty property. Somewhere inside the jail, a loose piece of metal rattled softly. Ethan glanced toward the dark entrance. A strange feeling continued growing inside him. Not fear, curiosity, the kind that made people keep opening doors even when common sense told them not to. Walter reached into the pocket of his denim jacket. For a moment, Ethan thought he was searching for keys. Instead, he pulled out a worn leather wallet. The edges were cracked with age. Carefully, he opened it and removed a faded photograph. He handed it to Ethan. The image was old and slightly yellowed. 3 men stood in front of Blackstone County Jail. One of them was unmistakable. Ethan recognized his father immediately. Younger, stronger, smiling. It was a smile Ethan rarely remembered seeing. Beside him stood Walter, nearly 40 years younger. The third man wore a sheriff's uniform. His face seemed familiar, though Ethan could not immediately place him. Then he saw something else. Hanging from his father's belt was a small brass key attached to a chain. The exact same chain emerging from the dirt beneath their feet. Ethan looked up sharply. "What is this?" Walter pointed toward the photograph. "That key disappeared the same year your father stopped talking about Blackstone." Ethan examined the image again. The chain was impossible to miss once he noticed it. "You are telling me that this chain belongs to that key?" Walter nodded. "I am telling you your father left something unfinished." Ranger suddenly stood. His ears rose high. The German shepherd turned toward Ethan's truck parked near the front gate. His posture stiffened instantly. Ethan followed his gaze. Across the road, partially hidden among a cluster of cottonwood trees, a dark vehicle sat motionless. The engine was off. The headlights were dark, but someone was inside, watching. Ethan narrowed his eyes. The vehicle had not been there earlier. Walter noticed it too. The color drained from his face. "You have visitors," he said quietly. Ethan never looked away from the distant silhouette. The instincts that had carried him through years of military service returned without effort. Calm, focused, alert. Ranger stepped closer to his side. The dog released a low rumble deep in his chest. Not fear. Warning. The dark vehicle remained still for several moments. Then, without turning on its headlights, it slowly backed away into the gathering darkness and disappeared beyond the trees. Ethan stared after it until the last trace vanished. When he finally looked back toward Walter, the old man seemed even more troubled than before. "That is not a good sign," Walter said. Ethan folded the photograph and slipped it carefully into his pocket. "Who was in that vehicle?" Walter's eyes drifted toward the jail. "I do not know." He paused. "But I know one thing." The wind rattled the broken bars overhead. Ranger remained fixed on the road. Walter swallowed hard. "Someone else knows you found the chain." Darkness settled fully across the Kansas plains by the time Walter Briggs finally climbed back into his pickup and drove away. His taillights disappeared down the empty county road, leaving Ethan alone with Ranger and the looming silhouette of Blackstone County Jail. The old building seemed larger at night, more watchful. Moonlight spilled across the rusted bars and broken windows, painting silver lines over a century of secrets. Ethan stood near the exposed chain for several minutes after Walter left. The photograph remained folded inside his jacket pocket. Every question seemed to create 2 more. His father, the chain, the key, the vehicle watching from the trees. None of it felt random anymore. Ranger sat quietly beside him, facing the road where the dark vehicle had vanished. The German Shepherd had not relaxed once since it appeared. That bothered Ethan more than he wanted to admit. Ranger trusted people easily when they deserved it. Distrust from him was rare. The night air carried the scent of dry grass, rust, and distant rain. Ethan finally grabbed a flashlight from the truck and walked toward the jail entrance. The heavy front door groaned softly as he pushed it open. Dust floated through the beam of light. The smell inside was old and stale, like forgotten paper and decades of silence. Ranger entered first. His nails clicked against cracked concrete floors. Cell doors lined both sides of the main corridor. Most hung open. Others remained locked behind thick layers of rust. Shadows stretched through the narrow hallways. Ethan swept the flashlight slowly across the walls. Time had left its mark everywhere. Peeling paint, water stains, faded numbers above the cells. Yet beneath the decay, the building still felt strangely solid, as though it had been built to outlive everyone who entered it. Ranger moved ahead, stopping occasionally to sniff corners and doorways. Ethan followed at an easy pace. He had spent enough years in unfamiliar places to understand patience. Buildings told stories if you listened carefully enough. Halfway down the corridor, Ranger suddenly stopped. His ears lifted. Ethan froze immediately. The dog stared toward the far end of the hall. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. Then Ethan heard it. A faint metallic tap. Soft. Almost imperceptible. Somewhere deeper inside the jail. Ranger walked forward without hesitation. Ethan followed. The corridor opened into what had once been the administrative offices. Most of the furniture had long since disappeared. Only rusted filing cabinets remained, standing like silent sentries beneath layers of dust. Moonlight slipped through broken windows and cast pale rectangles across the floor. Ranger crossed the room and stopped beside a large metal desk pushed against the wall. He sniffed carefully around one side. Then he sat down. Ethan aimed his flashlight beneath the desk. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then the beam caught a small wooden box wedged behind one of the desk legs. It was covered in dust, hidden so completely that nobody would notice it without looking directly underneath. Ethan knelt and carefully pulled it free. The wood felt dry and brittle beneath his fingers. There was no lock, no markings, just age. Ranger watched closely as Ethan lifted the lid. Inside sat a yellowed envelope. Nothing else. The paper looked fragile. Ethan opened it carefully. A single folded note rested inside. His pulse quickened as he unfolded it. The handwriting was immediately familiar. He had seen it on birthday cards, Christmas gifts, notes left on the kitchen counter years ago. It belonged to his father. Ethan stared silently for several seconds before reading the words. If you were holding this, Ranger found what I hoped he would. Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. He read the line again. Then a third time. Ranger remained beside him, calm and steady. Somehow the message felt impossible. The note continued. Trust the dog. Trust what he finds, not what people tell you. Ethan swallowed hard. The flashlight trembled slightly in his hand. His father had written this long before Ranger ever entered his life. Years before. Yet somehow he had mentioned the dog by name. Ethan lowered the note and stared into the darkness beyond the office. Questions raced through his mind. How could his father know? Why leave the message here? What was hidden inside this place that required such secrecy? Then Ranger stood abruptly. His head turned toward the second floor. The dog's ears locked forward. Every muscle in his body became rigid. Ethan listened carefully. For several seconds, there was only silence. Then came the unmistakable sound of a floorboard creaking overhead. Slow, deliberate, as though someone had just taken a single step in the darkness above them. Ranger did not bark. He did not move. He simply stared toward the darkness above them. Ethan remained perfectly still, listening. The old jail seemed to hold its breath. Moonlight filtered through broken windows, casting pale shapes across the dusty floor. Then the sound came again. Another creak. Slow, measured, not the random groan of an old building settling into the night. It sounded like weight shifting across wooden floorboards. Ethan switched off his flashlight. Darkness immediately swallowed the room. Years of training had taught him that sight was not always the most important sense. Sometimes silence revealed more than light. Ranger stayed. Beside him, ears forward, eyes fixed on the second floor landing. For several seconds, neither moved. Then Ethan heard something unexpected, a faint metallic rattle, soft enough to miss if he had not been listening carefully. It lasted only a moment before silence returned. Ethan slowly stepped backward toward the doorway. Ranger mirrored him perfectly. Together they moved into the main corridor. Above them, the shadows remained motionless. Yet the feeling of being watched refused to disappear. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and touched the folded note from his father. The paper felt real enough. The words felt impossible. Trust the dog. Trust what he finds, not what people tell you. He had repeated the sentence in his mind again and again since reading it. Somehow it seemed even more important now. Ranger suddenly turned away from the staircase. Ethan frowned. The dog was no longer focused on whatever had been above them. Instead, he walked quickly down the corridor toward the rear section of the jail. His pace was deliberate, purposeful. Ethan followed without hesitation. The German shepherd led him past rows of empty cells and through a rusted security gate hanging partially open on broken hinges. The air grew cooler as they moved deeper into the building. Dust coated every surface. Cobwebs stretched across corners untouched for years. Yet Ranger never slowed. He finally stopped outside a narrow cell near the back wall. The number above the door had almost completely faded, leaving only a faint outline. Ethan stepped closer. At first glance, the cell looked no different from the others. A rusted bunk frame, cracked concrete, peeling paint, nothing remarkable. Ranger lowered his head and began sniffing the floor near the far corner. Then he scratched once. Ethan knelt beside him. The concrete appeared ordinary until he brushed away a layer of dust. Beneath it, he noticed a thin, straight line. Then another. The shape formed a rough square about 3 feet across. His pulse quickened. Someone had cut through the floor at some point and carefully concealed the seam. Ethan ran his fingers along the edge. The workmanship was surprisingly precise. Whatever lay beneath had been meant to stay hidden. Ranger looked up at him expectantly. Ethan smiled despite himself. You never stop, do you? The dog wagged his tail once. A quiet gust of wind drifted through the jail. Somewhere outside, a distant owl called into the night. Ethan searched the cell for anything that might help lift the concealed section. His flashlight beam swept across the walls until it stopped on a small metal ring partially embedded near the floor. Most people would never have noticed it. He reached forward and pulled. Nothing happened at first. Then, with a faint grinding sound, the square section shifted slightly. Dust rose into the air. Ethan carefully lifted the concealed panel. Beneath it was not a tunnel, not a safe, not treasure. It was a narrow compartment. Inside rested a single, weathered leather journal wrapped in oilcloth. Ethan stared at it for several seconds. The wrapping had protected it from moisture for decades. Ranger sat quietly beside him. Somehow the dog seemed almost satisfied. Ethan carefully lifted the journal into the moonlight. The leather cover was worn but intact. He opened the first page. Immediately his breath caught. Written across the top in familiar handwriting were 4 simple words. Property of Daniel Walker, his father. Beneath that title was a date from 30 years earlier. Ethan slowly turned the page. The first sentence sent a chill through him. If anyone besides my son is reading this, then the wrong people found it first. For a long moment, Ethan simply stared at the page. The flashlight beam trembled slightly across the yellowed paper. The words felt less like a journal entry than a message his father had pushed through time with both hands. Ranger sat beside him, his amber eyes reflecting the pale light. The old jail remained silent around them. Even the wind outside seemed to have faded away. Ethan turned the page carefully. The handwriting remained steady and familiar. His father had always written with the precision of a man who measured every word. The first entry was dated 30 years earlier. It described Blackstone not as a jail, but as something else entirely. A storage site. A place where records disappeared. A place where certain truths were hidden when powerful people wanted them forgotten. Ethan read slowly, absorbing every line. According to the journal, his father had been assigned to inventory old evidence and archived files scheduled for destruction. At first it seemed routine. Then he discovered records that did not match official reports. Missing property, altered documents, land transfers involving prominent families throughout the county. Entire pages referenced names Ethan recognized from local businesses, political offices, and community boards. The deeper his father investigated, the more inconsistencies appeared. One sentence had been underlined twice. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in a small town is not what people know. It is what everyone agrees to pretend they never saw. Ethan felt a chill crawl across his shoulders. He continued reading. Several entries later, his father's tone changed. The handwriting grew tighter, more urgent. He described receiving warnings from people he once trusted, friends who suddenly stopped returning calls, meetings that ended when he entered the room, conversations that changed direction whenever certain topics appeared. No direct threats, just silence, isolation, doors quietly closing. Ethan understood that kind of pressure. Sometimes people did not need to confront you openly. They simply made sure you stood alone. Ranger suddenly lifted his head. Ethan froze. The dog listened carefully toward the corridor beyond the cell. For several seconds, neither moved. Then Ranger relaxed again. Whatever had caught his attention seemed to pass. Ethan returned to the journal. Near the middle of the notebook, a folded page had been tucked between two entries. He opened it carefully. It was a map. Not of the county, not of the town, of the jail itself. Hand-drawn in pencil. Several locations had been circled. One circle marked the cell where Ethan now sat. Another marked the administrative office where he had found the note earlier. But a third circle appeared in a place Ethan had not yet explored. The basement. He frowned. During his walk through the building, he had not seen any obvious access to a basement level. Yet his father had clearly marked one beneath the structure. At the bottom of the map, another note had been written in smaller letters. The key opens more than a door. Ethan stared at the sentence. The brass key from the old photograph immediately came to mind. The same key connected somehow to the chain buried outside. His father had hidden clues in multiple locations. Notes, a journal, a map. It all pointed toward something larger. Something he had spent decades protecting. Ethan carefully turned another page. His breath caught. Taped inside was a faded newspaper clipping. The article described a fire that had damaged part of Blackstone County Jail 30 years ago. Officially, the blaze was considered accidental. Yet beneath the article, his father had written 4 words in red ink. The fire was intentional. Ethan looked up slowly. Moonlight spilled through the bars of the old cell. Dust floated silently through the air. Somewhere above them, deep within the upper level of the building, another floorboard creaked. This time it was closer. Much closer. Ranger rose immediately and stepped between Ethan and the cell door. The German shepherd's gaze locked onto the darkness beyond the corridor. Then, for the first time all night, a faint light appeared upstairs. A narrow beam moved briefly across a broken window before vanishing again. The narrow beam of light vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Ethan remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the dark second-floor window. Ranger stood beside him, every muscle tense beneath his sable coat. The old jail seemed alive with silence. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the plains, low and distant, like a warning carried on the wind. Ethan carefully closed the journal and slipped it into his backpack. Whatever answers it contained, this was no longer the place to study them. Someone else was inside Blackstone. Someone who either knew about the journal or was searching for the same thing. Ranger took a slow step forward. Then another. His gaze never left the upper level. Ethan trusted the dog completely. If Ranger sensed danger, there was a reason. Together they moved into the corridor. Dust swirled through pale moonlight spilling between rusted bars. The staircase to the second floor stood at the far end of the hall. Old wooden steps climbed into darkness. Ethan approached carefully. Every sound seemed amplified. The faint scrape of his boots. The soft click of Ranger's nails against concrete. The distant whistle of wind through broken windows. Halfway to the stairs, Ranger suddenly turned left. Instead of continuing upward, he entered what had once been the booking office. Ethan followed. The room was small and cluttered with forgotten debris. Filing cabinets leaned against one another. Broken shelves sagged beneath years of neglect. Ranger crossed directly to the far wall and stopped beside a tall metal cabinet lying on its side. He sniffed once. Then he pawed at the floor. Ethan knelt beside him. Hidden beneath the cabinet was a narrow gap between the wall and the floorboards. Barely visible. He shined his flashlight inside. Something glinted back. Reaching carefully into the opening, he pulled out a small brass object covered in dust. His heart skipped. It was a key. The same style. The same shape. The same brass color shown in the photograph Walter had given him. Ethan turned it over in his hand. Tiny scratches covered the surface. Along one edge, 2 letters had been engraved. BC Blackstone County. Ranger stared at the key as if he had expected it all along. Ethan looked back toward the backpack containing the map from his father's journal. The key opens more than a door. The sentence suddenly carried new weight. A flash of lightning illuminated the room through shattered glass. For an instant, the entire jail glowed white. And in that brief moment, Ethan noticed something else. Written faintly on the wall behind the fallen cabinet was a message. The paint had nearly disappeared with age. Most people would never have seen it. He stepped closer. The handwriting matched the journal. It was his father's. If you found the key, do not trust the records room. Ethan stared at the words. A chill moved through him. The records room was located upstairs. According to the map, it sat directly above their current position. Another roll of thunder echoed outside. Then came a new sound. A door closing somewhere on the second floor. Not slamming. Not crashing. Closing softly. Deliberately. Ethan and Ranger looked toward the staircase at the same moment. Someone was definitely up there. The question was why. Ethan slipped the brass key into his pocket and reached for the flashlight. Ranger moved ahead without hesitation. The German Shepherd climbed the first few steps and stopped. His ears stood tall, his eyes fixed on the darkness above. Then, from somewhere beyond the upper hallway, a faint voice drifted through the building. Not loud, barely more than a whisper. Yet Ethan heard it clearly. One single sentence. He found it before we did. The whisper vanished into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared. Ethan froze halfway up the staircase. Ranger stood one step above him, silent and focused. Rain began tapping softly against the broken windows outside. The storm that had been gathering over the plains was finally arriving. Lightning flickered beyond the clouds, sending brief flashes through the upper level of Blackstone. Whoever had spoken knew about the key. More importantly, they knew Ethan had found it. The realization settled heavily in his mind. This was no longer a forgotten mystery buried by time. Someone was actively following the same trail. Ethan continued climbing. Each wooden step groaned softly beneath his weight. The second floor opened into a narrow corridor lined with offices and storage rooms. Most of the doors hung crooked on rusted hinges. Moonlight spilled across the floor in pale strips. Ranger moved slowly ahead, nose working the air. The scent of old paper, mildew, and dust filled the hallway. Yet beneath it lingered something else. A fresher scent. Recent. Human. Ethan did not need Ranger's reaction to know someone had been there not long ago. Halfway down the corridor, they reached a door marked records. The faded letters barely remained visible. Ethan immediately remembered the warning written on the wall downstairs. Do not trust the records room. He stared at the door for several seconds. Every instinct told him to be cautious. Ranger approached first. Instead of pawing at the entrance, he walked past it completely. The dog continued another 20 feet down the hallway before stopping beside a large framed notice hanging crookedly on the wall. Ethan frowned. The notice appeared ordinary. An old county document protected beneath cracked glass. Ranger nudged the bottom corner with his nose. Once. Then again. Ethan stepped closer. The frame shifted slightly. Not much. Just enough to catch his attention. He carefully lifted it from the wall. Behind it was not drywall or brick. Hidden within the wall sat a narrow metal panel. His pulse quickened. There was a keyhole in the center. The brass key felt surprisingly heavy in his pocket as he removed it. For a moment he hesitated. Then he inserted it into the lock. The mechanism turned smoothly despite its age. A soft click echoed through the corridor. Slowly, the panel swung inward. Behind it was a small compartment. Inside rested a leather folder sealed in plastic. Nothing else. Ethan removed it carefully. On the front, written in his father's handwriting, were 3 words. Not for them. Thunder rolled outside as Ethan opened the folder. The first document nearly made him stop breathing. It was a property deed. Not for farmland. Not for businesses. For Blackstone County Jail itself. According to the paperwork, ownership had secretly transferred decades ago into a private trust. A trust controlled by one man. Daniel Walker. Ethan stared at the signature. His father had owned Blackstone all along. The county sale. The $6 auction. Everything had been an illusion. The realization struck him like a bolt of lightning. His father had arranged for Ethan to inherit the jail without anyone realizing what it truly contained. Ranger sat quietly beside him as he turned the next page. More documents followed. Maps, financial records, letters. Each one connected powerful local names to hidden land deals stretching back 30 years. Then Ethan reached the final page. Unlike the others, it contained only a single handwritten sentence. He read it twice before fully understanding it. The jail was never the secret. What is buried beneath it is. A sudden sound echoed from the far end of the hallway. A door opening. Slow, careful, deliberate. Ethan looked up instantly. At the opposite end of the corridor, barely visible in the darkness, stood the silhouette of a man wearing a long coat. Neither moved. For several seconds, they simply stared at one another. Then the stranger quietly said 4 words. "You look like him." The stranger remained motionless at the far end of the corridor. Rain tapped against shattered windows while distant thunder rolled across the Kansas plains. Ethan tightened his grip on the leather folder. Ranger stepped slightly forward, positioning himself between Ethan and the silhouette. The German shepherd did not growl. He simply watched. The man slowly removed his hat. He appeared to be in his late 60s, with silver hair and a weathered face marked by years beneath the sun. His expression carried neither fear nor hostility, only exhaustion. "You have his eyes," the man said quietly. "The same look he had the last time I saw him." Ethan did not lower his guard. "You knew my father?" The man nodded. "Longer than most people in this town." Another flash of lightning illuminated the corridor. For a brief moment, Ethan saw the stranger clearly. He wore an old county maintenance jacket faded with age. A small stitched name rested above the pocket. "Franklin." The man glanced toward the folder in Ethan's hands. "Then you found the trust documents." Ethan said nothing. Franklin gave a faint smile. "That means Daniel's plan worked." Ranger remained focused on him. The old man slowly raised his empty hands. "I am not here to take anything. If I wanted those papers, I had 30 years to find them." Ethan studied him carefully. Something about his voice felt genuine. Tired. Honest. Like Walter Briggs. "Then why are you here?" Franklin looked toward the rain-streaked windows. "Because your father knew this day would come." Silence settled between them. The storm outside intensified. Wind pushed rain through broken sections of glass, scattering droplets across the dusty floor. Franklin took a slow step closer. Daniel never trusted the records room. That is why he built a second trail. Notes, maps, hidden compartments. He knew someday someone would try to erase everything. Ethan remembered the journal, the warnings, the concealed key. Every clue seemed to support what Franklin was saying. "What is buried beneath this place?" Ethan finally asked. Franklin's expression changed. For the first time, uncertainty appeared in his eyes. "That is the one thing he never told me." Ethan frowned. "You expect me to believe that?" "Believe whatever you want," Franklin replied softly. "I helped him protect it. I never saw it." Ranger suddenly turned his head toward the staircase leading downward. His ears lifted. Ethan noticed it immediately. The dog had heard something. Franklin noticed too. "You are not alone tonight," he said quietly. Ethan's pulse quickened. "The people following this secret. Who are they?" Franklin hesitated before answering. "Some are descendants of the original families. Some inherited positions. Others inherited silence. Most of them do not even know the full story anymore. They only know something valuable was hidden here decades ago." Another flash of lightning illuminated the hallway. Franklin looked toward the ceiling. Daniel used to say greed survives longer than memory. The words lingered in the air. Ethan thought about his relatives. The inheritance. The $6. The sudden auction. None of it felt accidental anymore. His father had been guiding him toward Blackstone long before his death. Franklin reached into his jacket pocket and removed a folded piece of paper. He handed it to Ethan. The page appeared torn from a notebook. A rough sketch covered the surface. Ethan immediately recognized the shape. It was another map of the jail, but this one revealed something different. A hidden stairway beneath the basement level. His breath caught. "There is another floor?" Franklin nodded. "A level not listed on any county blueprint." Ethan stared at the drawing. The hidden area sat directly beneath the foundation where Ranger had first discovered the buried chain. Everything connected back to that location. The chain, the key, the trust, the journal. His father had been pointing toward the same place all along. Then Franklin's expression darkened. "If you go down there, do not wait until morning." Ethan looked up. "Why?" The old man glanced toward the nearest window. Beyond the rain-covered glass, Faint headlights appeared at the edge of the property. One vehicle, then another, slowly entering through the front gate. Franklin exhaled heavily, because they finally figured out where Daniel sent you. The headlights glowed through the rain like distant eyes searching the darkness. Ethan stepped closer to the broken window and watched the vehicles roll slowly across the gravel lot below. Their engines remained quiet, their movements deliberate. Whoever had arrived was not lost. They knew exactly where they were going. Franklin lowered his voice. "You do not have much time." Ranger stood beside the window, staring down at the approaching vehicles. The German shepherd's ears remained locked forward. Ethan looked at the hand-drawn map again. The hidden level beneath Blackstone suddenly felt more important than ever. His father had spent decades protecting something buried beneath the jail. People were still searching for it 30 years later. That alone told him everything he needed to know. "Show me where the entrance is," Ethan said. Franklin nodded immediately. Together they moved back toward the staircase. Rain hammered against the roof overhead. Thunder shook the old building. Shadows danced across the walls with every flash of lightning. As they descended to the main floor, Ethan noticed how quiet the jail had become, almost expectant, like a place holding its breath before revealing a secret. Franklin led them through the rear corridor toward the cell where Ranger had discovered the hidden journal. The old man moved surprisingly fast despite his age. "The county blueprints were altered years ago," he explained quietly. "The lower level was removed from every official record. Most people forgot it ever existed." Ranger trotted ahead and entered the cell first. Ethan followed. The concealed compartment beneath the floor remained open where he had found the journal. Franklin knelt beside the opening and brushed away decades of dust from the surrounding concrete. Slowly, a narrow metal ring appeared near the edge of the wall. Ethan had missed it completely earlier. Franklin pulled the ring upward. A section of concrete shifted with a deep, grinding sound. Dust filled the air. Beneath it appeared a steep iron staircase descending into darkness. Cold air drifted upward from below, air untouched by sunlight. Ethan shined his flashlight downward. The beam vanished into the blackness. "How deep?" he asked. Franklin shook his head. "I never went all the way down." Ethan looked at him sharply. "Never. Your father would not allow it." The answer surprised him. Franklin gave a faint smile. "Daniel trusted very few people. He trusted me enough to protect the entrance. Nothing more." Ranger immediately started down the stairs. His confidence settled Ethan's nerves. The German shepherd disappeared into the darkness without hesitation. Ethan followed. The metal steps echoed softly beneath his boots. The air grew cooler with every foot they descended. 20 feet, 30 feet, 40 feet. The sounds of the storm gradually faded above them. At the bottom, the staircase opened into a stone corridor unlike anything else in the jail. The walls were older, much older. Rough limestone blocks stretched into darkness on both sides. It looked less like a basement and more like something built generations earlier. Ranger stood waiting at the end of the corridor. His amber eyes reflected the flashlight beam. Ethan slowly swept the light across the space. Old wooden shelves lined one wall. Rusted lanterns hung from hooks. A heavy steel door stood at the far end. Then he noticed something else. Photographs. Hundreds of them. Carefully pinned across an entire wall. Families. Farms. Businesses. Town meetings. Newspaper clippings. Election campaigns. Decades of local history preserved beneath the jail. Ethan stepped closer. Many faces were familiar. Some belonged to current officials. Others belonged to people long gone. At the center hung a photograph of his father, younger, standing beside a group of men outside Blackstone. Several faces had been circled in red ink. Beneath the photograph, Daniel Walker had written a single sentence. "These are the men who started it." Ethan stared at the words. His pulse quickened. This was no treasure vault, no hidden fortune. It was something far more dangerous and far more valuable. Evidence, history, truth. Then Ranger moved toward the steel door at the end of the chamber. He sat directly in front of it and looked back at Ethan, waiting. Ethan approached slowly. A brass lock sat in the center of the door, the exact size and shape of the key resting in his pocket. The brass key felt cold in Ethan's hand. For a moment, he simply stood before the steel door, listening to the silence beneath Blackstone. Above them, the storm continued its march across the prairie. Distant thunder reached the underground chamber as a faint vibration through stone. Ranger remained seated beside the lock, calm and patient, as if he had already solved the mystery and was merely waiting for Ethan to catch up. Franklin stopped several feet behind them. His eyes never left the door. "Daniel spent years protecting whatever is inside," he said quietly. "I have wondered about it every day since." Ethan looked at the worn brass key. His father's clues had all led here. The chain, the journal, the hidden maps, the trust documents. Every path converged at this single lock. Slowly, he inserted the key. The mechanism resisted at first. Then, with a deep metallic click, it turned. The sound echoed through the underground chamber. Ranger immediately stood. Ethan pulled the heavy handle. The door opened inward with surprising ease. Cold air drifted from the darkness beyond. His flashlight beam swept into the room. What he found was not what he expected. There were no stacks of cash, no gold bars, no priceless artifacts. Instead, the room resembled a private archive. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling. Hundreds of carefully labeled boxes filled the space. Filing cabinets lined the walls. Photographs, journals, property records, correspondence, and videotapes occupied every available surface. Ethan stepped forward slowly. The room smelled faintly of paper, cedar, and time. His father had not hidden wealth. He had hidden the town's missing conscience. Franklin entered behind him and stopped abruptly. "My God," he whispered. Ethan approached the nearest shelf. Each box carried a date. Some stretched back 40 years. Others were more recent. Entire decades of records had been preserved underground. He opened one of the boxes carefully. Inside sat folders containing property transactions from across the county. Many involved the same families whose names appeared in his father's journal. Another box contained letters exchanged between local officials. Another contained photographs documenting land transfers and business deals. Piece by piece, a picture began forming. For generations, influential people had quietly acquired property, redirected public funds, and manipulated records to benefit themselves. Nothing dramatic, nothing sensational. Just thousands of small decisions hidden beneath paperwork and silence. The kind of truth that survives because nobody connects all the pieces. Until now, Ranger wandered deeper into the archive. His nose moved along the lowest shelf. Then he stopped beside a wooden chest resting alone against the far wall. Ethan followed immediately. Unlike everything else in the room, the chest was not labeled. A small envelope rested on top. His name was written across it in his father's handwriting. Ethan sat down slowly and opened it. Inside was a single letter. The paper trembled slightly in his hands as he began reading. "Son, if you are reading this, then Ranger succeeded where I hoped he would. I knew someday the truth would need a guardian stronger than me. Not someone powerful, not someone wealthy, not even someone untouched by anger. Someone who would choose what is right even when it costs him everything." Ethan swallowed hard. The words blurred briefly before he blinked away the emotion. The letter continued. "The people who hurt this town are not the real enemy. Fear is the enemy. Silence is the enemy. The belief that ordinary people cannot make a difference is the enemy. That is why I saved these records. Not to destroy anyone. To give honest people a chance to choose differently." Ethan lowered the letter. For years he had wondered why his father seemed distant. Why he carried burdens he never explained. Sitting beneath Blackstone, the answer finally became clear. Daniel Walker had spent decades protecting the truth, waiting for the right moment to pass it forward. Ranger nudged Ethan's arm gently. Ethan looked down. The German shepherd's amber eyes reflected the flashlight beam. Steady, loyal, certain. Then Franklin moved closer to the chest and noticed something attached beneath the lid. A final note. He carefully unfolded it. His expression changed instantly. "Ethan," he said softly, "you need to see this." Ethan took the note and read the first line. His breath caught. It was a list of names. At the very top sat a name he never expected to find. His own brother. For several seconds, Ethan forgot how to breathe. The name sat at the top of the page like a shadow reaching up from his own bloodline. Caleb Walker. His older brother. The same brother who had stood silently during the reading of their father's will. The same brother who inherited the farm, the equipment, the accounts, and everything else Daniel Walker had spent a lifetime building. Ethan read the name again, hoping he had misunderstood. He had not. Ranger sat quietly beside him, his head resting near Ethan's knee. The simple gesture grounded him. Around them, The underground archive remained silent except for the distant rumble of thunder filtering through layers of stone. Franklin looked away respectfully. He understood that some discoveries were heavier than others. Ethan forced himself to continue reading. Beneath each name appeared dates, transactions, and notes written in his father's careful handwriting. Caleb's entry stretched across multiple pages. Yet what Ethan found surprised him. His father had not listed Caleb as an enemy. Quite the opposite. Daniel had marked his name with a single phrase. Tried to warn them. Ethan frowned. He turned another page. Additional notes explained that years earlier, Caleb had stumbled across evidence connected to the hidden records. At first, he had wanted to expose everything. But pressure came quickly. Business partners, community leaders, friends, people he trusted. They convinced him to remain silent. Not through threats, through fear. Fear of losing his reputation. Fear of dividing the family. Fear of becoming an outcast in the town where he had spent his entire life. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Suddenly, the inheritance made more sense. His father had not rewarded Caleb. He had protected him. Daniel knew the records would eventually surface. When they did, Caleb would face impossible questions. The farm had never been a prize. It had been a shield. Ranger nudged Ethan's arm again. This time the German shepherd stood and walked toward another shelf near the back wall. Ethan followed. The dog stopped beside a small wooden box tucked behind several folders. It looked insignificant compared to everything else in the archive. Ethan opened it carefully. Inside sat an old videotape and a folded letter. The letter carried today's date. Not 30 years ago. Not 20 years ago. Today. Ethan's pulse quickened. He unfolded the page. Son, if you are reading this, then events moved faster than I expected. There is one final truth you must understand. The records are important. The archive is important. But neither is the reason I brought you here. Ethan read the sentence twice. His father continued. What is hidden beneath Blackstone is not evidence. It is proof that ordinary people can choose courage over fear. If these records become public, do not seek revenge. Seek honesty. Let the truth do what anger never can. Ethan lowered the letter slowly. For years he had carried resentment toward his family, toward the town, toward the silence surrounding his father. Yet sitting beneath the jail, surrounded by decades of secrets, he realized Daniel Walker had never been building a case against people. He had been preserving a chance for redemption. Suddenly a loud knock echoed from somewhere above them. Then another. Not violent. Not threatening. Deliberate. Franklin looked toward the staircase. They found the entrance. Ethan stood immediately. Ranger moved beside him. Another knock followed. Then a voice drifted down through the stone corridor. Familiar. Nervous. Human. Ethan. The sound froze him in place. He knew that voice. He had known it his entire life. It belonged to Caleb. Ethan, the voice called again. Please, before you decide what to do with those records, there is something you need to know about Dad's last night alive. For a long moment, no one moved. The underground archive seemed suspended between past and present. Rain whispered against the world above while the weight of decades rested silently on shelves surrounding them. Ethan stared toward the staircase. Ranger stood at his side, steady as ever. Then Caleb appeared at the bottom of the steps. He looked older than Ethan remembered from only a few days earlier. Not older in years. Older in burden. Water dripped from his coat. His eyes moved across the archive, across the boxes, the photographs, the records, and finally settled on the letter in Ethan's hand. For several seconds, neither brother spoke. The silence carried too much history. Too many unanswered questions. Finally, Caleb lowered his head. Dad told me about this place the night before he died, he said quietly. Ethan felt anger rise, then fade almost immediately. There was no triumph in Caleb's voice. Only regret. You knew? Ethan asked. Caleb nodded. Not everything. Just enough. He stepped closer, his gaze moving toward the shelves. He brought me here because he was worried he was running out of time. He showed me some of the records. He told me what they meant. Then he told me something I never forgot. Franklin remained silent in the background. Ranger watched both brothers carefully. Caleb swallowed. He said the truth is not valuable because it destroys people. It is valuable because it gives people a chance to become better than they were. Ethan remembered the words in the final letter. They sounded exactly like their father. Caleb continued. I wanted to expose everything immediately. I was angry. I wanted names published. I wanted public apologies. Dad stopped me. His voice cracked slightly. He told me anger is easy. Grace is harder. The underground chamber fell silent again. Ethan looked around at the archive. The evidence his father had protected for decades was more than a record of mistakes. It was a record of choices. Good choices. Bad choices. Human choices. The storm outside slowly began to weaken. Thunder rolled farther away now. Caleb reached into his coat and removed a small envelope. The paper was worn from being carried. For years, Dad left this for you. Ethan accepted it carefully. On the front, in familiar handwriting, were two simple words. For Ethan. He opened it slowly. Inside rested a single sheet of paper. No long explanation. No hidden clue. Just one paragraph. Son, if you found this place, then Ranger kept his promise better than any man could. I never wanted you to inherit land or money. I wanted you to inherit purpose. The world does not need more people chasing power. It needs more people willing to protect what is right. Whatever you choose to do next, choose mercy when possible and courage when necessary. Ethan read the words twice. Then a third time. His eyes drifted toward Ranger. The German shepherd sat quietly beneath the warm beam of his flashlight, tail resting against the stone floor. Through every clue, every hidden room, every unanswered question, the dog had never once doubted the path forward. Loyalty had guided them where fear could not. Weeks later, the records from Blackstone would finally reach honest investigators, historians, and community leaders. Truth would emerge slowly, carefully, without revenge. Some people would apologize. Some would step away from positions they no longer deserved. Others would spend years rebuilding trust. But the town would heal. And that mattered more. Blackstone would never be a prison again. Instead, Ethan transformed the property into something entirely different. A rescue and rehabilitation center for abandoned dogs and struggling veterans. A place where second chances lived side by side. Above the entrance hung a simple wooden sign. Ranger Rescue Ranch. Visitors often asked why the dog's name came first. Ethan always smiled when they did. On quiet evenings, he would sit on the porch beside Ranger and watch the Kansas sunset paint gold across the fields. The storms always passed eventually. The truth always found its way into the light. And sometimes, when people asked how he discovered everything hidden beneath Blackstone, Ethan would look down at the German shepherd resting beside him and answer with complete honesty. I didn't find it. He did.